IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. Imagine you're walking down the street in your city. You're approached by the police, which begins asking you questions that suggest some suspicious activity on your part. What would you think? Such a scenario is not at all futuristic. It is happening right now in different countries around the world. And a new documentary, Coded Bias, which has just dropped on Netflix all over the world, decodes this, tells us the scary implications of such an eventuality and how facial recognition technology is being welcomed by police all over the world, from dictatorships to democracies. The name of the film is Coded Bias, and it's been made by Shalini Kantayya, a young filmmaker in the US, and it premiered at the prestigious Sundance Festival in 2020. Shalini's other films, including Catching the Sun, which was produced by Leonardo DiCaprio, and Every Drop of Life. Is that correct, Shalini?
Yes, A Drop of Life with Nandita Das.
A Drop of Life, which followed the lives of an African-American corporate executive and an Indian village teacher, and they both face the same problem or shortage of water. Her Twitter bio says she's a filmmaker, activist, and a science fiction fanatic. And I must say, after seeing the film, I can well understand that. We'll talk to Shalini right after this short break.
Have you heard of the Cred Rewards Festival going on this IPL season? From the 27th of April to the 3rd of May, you stand a chance to win crazy jackpots every day and offers from partners on specific days. This is the Cred Rewards Festival, so download Cred now.
Shalini, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thanks so much for having me, Sidharth.
Okay. At the outset, let me tell you that your documentary alarmed and frightened me. The scenario sounds so implausible and yet so real. Have you heard that reaction elsewhere?
Absolutely. People often talk about it as disturbing, terrifying, and yet somehow hopeful.
Hopeful, yes, especially since there are these scholars, writers, activists fighting against it. But is it something that we should be really concerned about, or is it just at the experiment stage in different parts of the world?
Absolutely. I think, before I started making this film, I didn't realize the way in which algorithms, machine learning, artificial intelligence is increasingly becoming a gatekeeper of opportunity, deciding really important things as who gets hired, who gets what quality of healthcare. Here in the US, it can even decide or play a role in deciding how long a prison sentence someone may serve. And at the same time, as I was learning about the ways in which we are outsourcing our autonomy, our very decision-making to machines, I came across the work of Joy Buolamwini and so many others in the film, like Kathy O'Neill, who wrote a book called Weapons of Mass Destruction. And I came to realize that these same systems that we're trusting to make such important decisions have not been vetted for racial bias or for gender bias, or that they won't discriminate against people. In some cases, they haven't even been vetted for some standard form of accuracy. And so what I realized is that, everything that we love, I feel very proud that I'm, sort of from two of the largest democracies in the world. And everything we love as people of a democracy, access to accurate information, the fact that certain communities won't be over police, fair housing, equal rights, all of these things that we value in democracies, everything is being transformed by artificial intelligence. And so it is really my belief that we all should be concerned about the way these technologies are designed and deployed in democracies all over the world.
Yeah, so I'll come to the question of accuracy in a little while, on also the question of the impact on daily lives. The examples you gave of China and the US were really scary. But I'll come to that. But tell us how you came upon this film, and tell us a little bit about your journey before that as a filmmaker, where you got interested in filmmaking, etc.
Well, actually, I fell in love with images on a trip to India when I was 19. And I was actually in Bailakuppe, which is one of the 13 villages that India has gifted Tibet. And I was listening to these Tibetan monks pray. And I realized that there were certain stories that I couldn't tell in words, that certain stories had to be told visually. And I really had the experience of falling in love with visual images on that trip to India. And I'm someone who believes that stories can change the world, that storytelling is a form of leadership. And the kinds of stories I've been most interested in have to do with disruptive technology and the ways in which technology can make the world more fair or less fair. And I sort of love looking towards the future. So I made a film called A Drop of Life, which was set in Kutch and was a sort of a science fiction film starring Nandita Das and Lisa Jessie Peterson. And I did a film called A Drop of Life, which is about the promise of small-scale solar energy to uplift the lives of working people and to save money for many working people. And with this film, I sort of stumbled down the rabbit hole. As I said, 3 years ago, I didn't even know what an algorithm was. Everything that I knew about artificial intelligence came from, say, the mind of Steven Spielberg or other science fiction filmmakers like Stanley Kubrick or Ridley Scott. And I don't think that my background as a sci-fi fanatic really prepared me to understand how AI is being used in the now. And in all my films, whether they are fiction or documentary, I embark on a journey of very rigorous research. And what I found in the making of Coded Bias was as alarming to me as it is, I think, to audiences who watch the film.
The film opens with Joy Bolangwini, who's in MIT, and she sets out to do a student experiment and says, let me check out facial recognition. And she's a person of color. She's an African American. It doesn't recognize her. The algorithms are simply not prepared to recognize her. And yet, when she puts on a standard white mask, and it's not even it's just white with nothing on it, it immediately starts reading her. So that, I think, sets her off on this journey. And it's a good entry point into the film. But what does she discover about these kind of algorithms? Because ultimately, the thing is about impersonal algorithms. What does she discover that leads her to research it further? And I understand Joy is an activist. So what are the things that she discovers about this?
Well, you're quite right. I mean, Joy was just a graduate student at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology at MIT when she's just trying to make an art project work, something like a Snapchat filter, where and the facial recognition software that she's using does not see her face until she puts on this bright white mask that is not skin tone even for anyone who is even white. It's whiter than white. And yet the technology reads that, which is no one's skin tone, more than it reads her actually black face. And I think what is significant about that opening scene and her startling discovery was that this was not technology that was being beta tested on a shelf somewhere in a laboratory. This was technology that was already being sold here in the US to the FBI, already being sold to ICE, our immigration officials, already being sold and deployed oftentimes in secret to police departments all over our country without any guidance from anyone that we elected, no government oversight. And so what is so alarming about Joy's discovery is, the very real realization that this technology that is racially biased is being sold right from big tech to law enforcement, and with some very harsh realities for who this might impact. And so she sets off first to look at the science of it and to explore, is this racial bias across all sort of commercially available facial recognition technology? And she finds, yes, indeed it is. And then, she goes a step further, which is she draws this racially biased technology to the communities who are impacted by its harms. And that's something sometimes scientific researchers don't do. They're sort of in the sort of pixels and in the ones and zeros of the technology. And sometimes they're not thinking about whom this technology could hurt. And in the States, as I said, there are no laws that govern this technology. And I couldn't even find out how this was being used by police departments in the US. It's often being deployed in secret. I had to go to the UK. You've seen some scenes that were shot in the United Kingdom, which at one time, at the time of shooting, was part of Europe. And during that time, it was protected by the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regimen, which made that process transparent to me. And in Europe, where we can get statistics, they found that this technology was resulted in 85% of people being misidentified by police use of facial recognition.
85%?
Yeah, the most conservative statistics. Some of those statistics go up to 92. I'm giving you the most conservative statistics. So that means 85% of the people in the UK who are who have been stopped by the police by facial recognition were wrongly stopped. And you see a couple of examples of that in the film, including a child who's wrongly stopped by facial recognition, wrongful identification.
Shalini, right off the bat, Joy suggests and the film suggests that this is because of inherent biases in the algorithm making. The US has 117 million faces in their database, but the inherent bias comes from two streams. One, that it is geared towards white faces. And two, which is more controversial in my opinion, it is because the big 6 or 8 tech company chiefs are white men, which of course now has changed a bit because there are 2 people of Indian origin also, but you know what I mean. So is this really a kind of accidental bias or a bias which is guided in a particular way?
Both. I think in one sense, the thing that I have more compassion for is that bias is not something that's in a few bad people. It's not just in a few bad human beings have bias. That bias is actually an inherent human condition. And we're all carrying biases that are oftentimes unconscious even to us. And when it comes to technology, we like to think of technology like our gods, but I think more accurately, they're more like our children in the sense that they are replicating our biases and our flaws, and we're passing on some of the flaws that we have, even the ones we would not like to pass on. So I think that part of it is that these systems are being trained, just like you train a child to learn off of data sets that are mostly male, mostly white, mostly middle-aged, these kinds of biases. So the systems then don't see dark faces as accurately or women as accurately or young people as accurately. But then there's another thing, which is that Silicon Valley has an inclusion crisis. In my own industry, we had like an Oscar So White movement. And it was a movement to show that Hollywood was not reflecting the world that we live in. And in Silicon Valley, almost since the beginning, they've had this inclusion crisis. And one is around gender. Less than 14% of AI researchers are women. And the other is that the people who are making very critical decisions about the technologies, the AI technologies that are deployed around the world, are a small group of Silicon Valley technologists that are mostly white, mostly male, mostly from elite educational backgrounds and economic backgrounds. And so there is no one in the room to sort of check their biases. And I think it's alarming to me that 3 Black women graduate students, Joy Belawini, Dr. Timnit Gebru, Deborah Raji, were able to discover racial bias in technology that somehow IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon missed. And I think that's very significant and talks about how important it is that we have women, that we have people of color, that we have people from different educational backgrounds in the room when these technologies are designed. That being said, I also think that we're in we've had a stunning lack of imagination about how these technologies can be used, because there are just 9 companies in the US and China who are leading sort of the technology around artificial intelligence, just 9 companies. And that is because these companies have had a 15-year head start in gathering our data. So there will never be, as long as we don't have any policy around how these 9 companies have been allowed to consolidate our data, there cannot be innovation. There cannot be, sort of a small technology company that innovates and moves its way up. We have these 9 companies that are essentially monopolies in the space of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, it's a little spooky, but if you give me half a minute, I will set that right. Live
Amazing.
camera.
Lights, camera, action.
So again, to probe into that issue further, is it a conspiracy? Is it systemic? Is it from years of cultural upbringing? Or are they saying, okay, let's do something which will not incorporate, because the other departments, already this has been said about police, right, for years, that the police is inherently biased towards, the police system is inherently biased towards people of color. So is this planned, or is it just they may not even sometimes realize what they're doing?
I don't think they sometimes realize what they do, that they have their own biases and they don't have enough women and people of color who are shining a light into the biases of the main actors in Silicon Valley. And so their inherent bias shows up. And some of the bias is in the training data sets. It's in the images that that these systems are trained on. But I think that sometimes, in spite of the best intentions of the programmers, that these technologies pick up on the biases and the systematic inequalities who've been there. I'll give you one example. Amazon created an algorithm to help sort through resumes for hiring, thinking we'll make the world more fair, and we'll get human beings out of the process, and we'll just have the machine sort through resumes. But lo and behold, in spite of the best intentions of the programmers, the algorithm looked at who got hired, who got retained over a number of years, who got promoted over time, and it began to discriminate against anyone it could discern was a woman. If you had a women's lacrosse or a women's college or a women's sport on your resume, the AI system took you out of the applicant pool. And that's one example of the fact that even in spite of the best intentions of the programmers, that the system can pick up on past inequalities, that it can pick up on the ways in which the world has been unfair in the past. Another example is Steve Wozniak's wife, one of the founders of Apple. They found that she got a lower credit score on the Apple credit card than Steve Wozniak did, in spite of having all the same resources, all the same wealth and assets on paper. She got a lower credit score. And that could be because the algorithm was picking up on the fact that here in the US, women have had a shorter history to credit, may have had a shorter history of getting mortgages and owning property. And somehow the algorithm was picking up on that. I suppose Steve Wozniak's wife is probably okay on credit. I'm sure she won't be harmed by a system like this. But for the rest of us, we don't know why we've gotten that credit score. We don't know why we have such a limited access to financial credit that may impact our lives and our opportunity. And we may not even know that an algorithm was involved in denying us that opportunity or why. And that's an example of how these systems can discriminate against us, even sometimes in spite of the best intentions of the programmers.
There's a sequence which is really, really telling when the camera, when Silky Carol is standing on a street in London distributing pamphlets saying that Big Brother is watching and we need to ask questions to our legislator. She points at this police van, unmarked police van with two cameras on top where, a man walks by and he knows that this is a camera and he raises his jacket to cover his face and they start asking questions. Now, firstly, was that sequence planned or it just happened?
It just happened. And
while you were there?
While we were there, yes, filming. We were, I will say that I had to go to the UK to get footage like that because we don't have any laws in the US that would make that process transparent to us. Because UK was part of Europe, European Union has the GDPR, they have some transparency. And so the police had to report that trial to Silky's and made that process transparent to the human rights observers at Silky Carlo's organization, Big Brother Watch. And we were able to follow that instance. So the man just covers his face like this because he doesn't want to be recognized by police recognition. He's done nothing wrong. And he receives a ticket, and quite an expensive ticket. And I use the example, sort of a parallel in apartheid South Africa when Joy goes to the Apartheid Museum. And an apartheid historian is reminding him how colored people, Black, Indian, all of us, could be stopped arbitrarily by police just because we looked funny, just because just based on the color of our skin in South Africa. And I wanted to remind people that in a free society, free people of a democracy are not supposed to be stopped by police and asked for identification having done nothing wrong. That is the stuff of apartheid, that is the stuff of a society that is not free. And yet democracies all over the world are picking up these tools of authoritarian states. And so to me, that's a moment that we, the people of democracies, should all be very concerned. That's the line in the sand where police are stepping into our rights.
In Brooklyn, you show an apartment building where the tenants have to show their face to get in. I think you point out that such technologies are always tried out somebody points out that they're always tried out in poorer communities because they are treated like, lab rats, so to speak. And this woman who comes in says, I had a fob keychain, but now this. And the landlord has got away with it.
Well, there is a little bit of a hopeful story there because, this landlord who owns property in Manhattan in a wealthy building, that's not where he tried to install facial recognition. He tried to install facial recognition in a low-income community in Brooklyn. So it goes to show that he thought he could get away with it in this community where their rights would not be respected in the same way a high-income community in Manhattan maybe would. But, Trinae Moran and I.C. May Downs, who are Brooklyn residents, they didn't even know what biometric data was when their landlord tried to install facial recognition. And this is also a building that already had fobs, already had security cameras, already had a doorman watching you when you come into the building. And these are people who've not done anything wrong. They're just trying to go home and live a dignified life. And what is hopeful about their story is not only did they keep their landlord from installing this racially biased invasive surveillance technology in the place they lived, but they also inspired the first policy in the state of New York that would help protect other citizens from this type of facial recognition. And I think that it just goes to show that oftentimes these technologies are an extension of power. And in many cases, it's up to us to fight back.
In China, we have read, and I think you also tell us, that if the state, in any case, has complete control of your information and your entire life and controls it anyway, but now on the basis of, and this is what I've seen before the film too, on the basis of how it recognizes you, it throws up your entire biodata and it tells the state that you buy 4 bottles of liquor every month or every week. You've been behind your rent once and all that. And so that can have an impact on your travel plans, on getting a child into good school, any number of downstream things which could completely alter your life from the very beginning.
Absolutely. I mean, that is what is so scary about some of these systems is we trust them to be always accurate, and they're not accurate all the time. And I think people always talk about, sort of data privacy, but I don't think that when companies can buy and sell your data, they can create almost a complete psychological profile about you, almost a complete description of who you are. And it's a problem if it's correct, and it's a problem if it's incorrect. And so we need more protections on how our data can be used, because it really can limit our opportunity.
Shalini, there is China, there is Britain, there is America, and in fact, there is India too, where many states are already trying it. And the farmers' protests in India recently, which you may or may not have heard of, the police used it to find out who came for the particular day when there was a lot of agitation. No comment in the papers, of course, are laws, except for one activist or advocacy organization. Nobody else has brought this up. One can kind of understand a country like China doing it, but democracy is doing it without legislative control, without executive control, without legal boundaries. That is frightening, isn't it?
It's terrifying. I mean, you see that moment in China where the woman is using facial recognition with a social credit score, and her government is scoring her not just on her behavior, but the behavior of her friends and her family. And I think people in democracies who watch that scene, they kind of lose their mind. They think, oh my God, this is so 1984. And, if you get a bad score, you won't be allowed to travel. You won't be allowed to go on a train in China or a plane in China. If your social credit score falls beyond a certain amount, the young girl in China talks about how she doesn't have to get to know anyone. She'll judge people off that score. But I think you're right. It is terrifying to me to see democracies that I celebrate, like India, like the US, picking up these authoritarian tools. And, one of the things I celebrate about India is that we've had such strong people's movements. I think it's what makes India a great country, is that you've had such strong people's movements for rights that have resulted in real change and advances for people. And if you have police scanning your face when you go and protest, and you come from a vulnerable community, are you going to exercise your freedom to protest, your freedom to assemble, your freedom to have your voice heard in a democracy? And that sends a chilling effect to people's participation in their government, which to me is a form of patriotism. People who are expressing their voices and holding our governments to our highest ideals. And when we lose that, when the government sends this authoritarian message that if you come to this protest, we will scan you, we will identify you, we will know you by name, that is an infringement on our rights and our freedoms and democracies, and we should all be alarmed.
Do you think the work of activists is making a difference? Are legislators noting it? Lawmakers, are they waking up to it? Have you heard of any example of when a legislator has said, hey, wait a minute, this is interesting, let me take it up as an issue?
Absolutely. I mean, I look at Silky Carlo's organization, Big Brother Watch in UK, and there are essentially 3 young people sitting in an office building who have literally held back real-time use of police recognition in London. And that is the power of citizen activism and of us participating in our government. And I've seen it time and time again, whether you're talking about the Brooklyn residents who helped inspire the first policy in the state of New York. And I've also seen the importance of local bans, which I think had some resonance for India, where because we have such strong states with their own policy and townships and provinces. And you've seen cities in the US that are technological hubs where they most understand what these systems do, be the first to ban them. So San Francisco, Oakland, Cambridge, Boston, Somerville, all technological hubs have been the first to ban these technologies, facial recognition, by law enforcement and in their municipalities. And so it's my hope that we can sort of push these local bans across the country because it disrupts the power that big tech has.
I want to connect, this last a couple of questions, but I want to connect it with something you've been saying continuously, and so does the film, that it's inherently biased against people of color. Does this also do artificial intelligence or algorithms show bias against whites anywhere? Or let's say on economic grounds?
It may be in terms of, everything is on a algorithm analysis. Each algorithm is so different. But, I just spoke to some, health insurance industries. And in each of these systems, there's been a data set that the algorithm learns from. In a case in the US, there was a healthcare algorithm that was giving white patients better access to healthcare than Black patients. And so to me, it is, yes, that oftentimes it is sort of whites. Sometimes it's males often that are sort of predominant, both because of who's programming it and also because of the data sets that they're trained on. And often they're replicating systematic inequalities from the past. And in the past, it has been women and people of color who've been suffering from systematic inequalities. And so I have not yet found an algorithm that discriminates.
But women do, as you showed that Steve was
Yes.
the wife. Now that's privilege. So there must be women too, because I think their credit scores or whatever.
Oh, absolutely. It does discriminate against women.
And it could well be also, auto insurance or things like that, where you say that inherently men are better drivers. I'm just wondering.
Well, it's also that these algorithms can be predatory. So take, for example, it was found by our FTC that regulates the internet that kids in a zip code that has higher concentrations of Asian kids are getting higher pricing for standardized testing prep. So SAT prep and others, they're getting higher pricing if the zip code has higher concentrations of Asian kids. In a low-income neighborhood down the street, Latino kids are getting predatory ads for for-profit universities like the University of Phoenix, bogus universities that don't mean anything, that are just there to collect your money and don't actually educate you. And those kids are getting predatory ads for something else. And so to me, it's not just that there can be racial and gender bias, but that we're all vulnerable in some sort of way because these systems are creating psychological profiles of who it thinks we are. Zainab Tufekci gives the example of, it can tell that maybe that you have a predisposition for gambling. And it could be just sending you discount tickets for Vegas. These algorithms can tell maybe that can pick up on the fact that you're diabetic, potato chips. And at the moment that you're just vulnerable enough, it can, based on your behavior, can maybe even infer that you have a low blood sugar level and just be pushing you potato chips ads. Because, these things have no ethics. They have no morals. They have no empathy. The YouTube algorithm could pick up on the fact that maybe you have a predisposition for young women. And it's been shown that the algorithm will keep showing you younger and younger women until you reach girls and cross the line into a territory that is deeply, deeply unethical. And so it goes to show that it's not just some of us that are vulnerable, it's all of us, because it's creating this psychological profile of who we are and preying on us based on our dispositions in a way that is not ethical or moral.
Police systems are using it for surveillance. Corporate systems are using it for profits. And so basically both ways you are getting ambushed. One way or the other, you're no longer a citizen. You're either a potential troublemaker or you're a troubled person, or you are a consumer of goods and services, one way or the other. Anyway, do you think, you said in the beginning there is hope. What kind of hope do you see?
Well, I think certainly in a country like India that is such a technological hub, there's a great deal of genius that is still to be unleashed in these technologies. And I think we've not yet seen what artificial intelligence could look like for a public good. We've either seen this sort of state surveillance model or we've seen this corporate surveillance model. And yet, to me, that is a stunning lack of imagination about how these technologies could be used. And I would like to see AI sort of in the public good. It is a very powerful technology that we're just using in these ways that are not very imaginative, that are very authoritarian, that are very capitalistic in ways that can be unethical. So I think that makes a difference. The other thing is that, to me, this is really about the battle for civil rights in the future. And when you have democracies like India that have come so far in the last 50 years in guaranteeing the rights of all people, it still has some way to go, but it's come so far. It's had some of the most radical and transformative policy around including people that we've seen anywhere in the world. And I think that we've got to defend those policies by not rolling them back with these invisible algorithms. And I think, to me, that means that, one, we need an educated public, which is something I think we can do very well. A child is going to start using a cell phone when they're 10 years old. At that age, we should start teaching what happens to data. What is an algorithm? What is AI? How does it work with us? And we need to be shaping national and international literacy around these technologies, because it's around that it's through literacy that the next step can happen, which is empowerment. The other thing I think that can happen that I think has special resonance for India is we have to change the way computer science is taught. I'm seeing this new generation of computer scientists and AI ethicists who say, we need a women's studies class. We need an ethics class. We cannot we cannot program technology for society if we don't understand society, if we don't understand the impact that our technology is having on society. So I think changing the way that computer science is taught can be one way, and to teach it in a way that includes the liberal arts, that includes social movements, that includes ethics, can change the way these technologies are deployed. And then the last thing is, I think that we can support organizations that are fighting for civil rights in these technologies and around internet freedoms, because they will have such a profound impact on the way democracies move forward.
That's beginning to happen, I must tell you. There are organizations that have come up. They have had an impact. I won't give the details now, but they have had a real impact in terms of rolling back or pushing back certain legislation, certain corporate initiatives. But what are you going to do next?
Actually, I could share this, and I think this has good relevance too, is that I'm working on a film on TikTok.
Oh, nice. Lovely.
So
I think there's not that my opinion counts, but I think TikTok is very liberating for a lot of people. But go ahead.
Well, it's very interesting, and we will be covering sort of what's happened in India, and in terms of both, what it's the voice some rural TikTok creators have had in India, and especially from regions that are not Hindi or English speaking, in terms of making it onto reaching a new audience with their work. But also, I think the policy that India has had towards techno-nationalism and creating more of a nationalistic framework for technology, which I think is a very interesting trend as well.
That's fascinating because it's banned here at the moment. But yes, techno-nationalism is a good way of putting it. Thank you very much, Shalini. I think your film has just been released, so more and more people will see it. Thank you for giving an idea of the disturbing implications of facial recognition and artificial intelligence on a wider level. I hope the film makes a difference, gets citizens and organizations to object to be treated as units to be controlled. Thank you for joining us on the Wire Talks. That was Shalini Kantayya, a filmmaker from the US, who's made this film that I think anybody who's interested in privacy matters and where the future is going to be, especially if you're an overuser of your smartphone, where it will lead and where it shouldn't lead. We'll be back again next week with another episode of The Wire Talks. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. It was an honor.
You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week, Siet Tires and thewholetruthfoods.com. So this week on Advertising is Dead, Varun was joined by Mansi Zaveri. She shares her experience of running a community for parents of young kids and teenagers and of hosting a podcast along the same lines. Gauri Devidayal was joined by Divya Thani on This Round Is On Me. Divya works as a global editorial director with Condé Nast Traveler. They discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly of a travel writer's job. On Candid Kanan, Sid is in conversation with Adarsh Gaurav, who recently scored a BAFTA nomination for his role in the Netflix adaptation of The White Tiger. They talk about his role in the show, life pre and post-stardom, and so much more. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ritash and Ayushi talk about the precious time and opportunities lost to the lockdown and share their post-COVID wish list. When it comes to cricket this season, we have you covered. In English, we have Edges and Sledges, which do their show live on YouTube. They look for announcements over there. And for our Hindi listeners, we have Khel Neeti, hosted by Rajiv Mishra and ex-Indian cricketer Sabah Kareem. This show is live streamed on YouTube every day at 9:15. Definitely do check these out, and let's get you back to your show.
Come learn and experience the ABCDs of being queer with me, Shunetro,
and me, Farhad,
on our show, Gay BCD.
The two of us take you through our stories and experiences of being gay men in the city of Mumbai and have candid
and sometimes downright scandalous
conversations about sexuality, gay culture, and everything in between.
Catch new episodes of Gay BCD every Tuesday on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get all your podcasts from.
Working Monday to Friday glued to your chair making you feel dull? Worry not. Get your 5-minute weekly dose of travel around the world with postcards from nowhere. Join me every Thursday as I explore the strange, obscure, and fascinating parts of the world and bring out facets of travel you may not have thought of before. You can find us on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.